Well, good morning for everybody that's joined us. Welcome to our Planning Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals training. I know we have several others that will be joining us, so we'll just let them in when they're ready to come in. But we want to get started as close to on time as possible so we can move things along. We know you're busy. I'm Kathy Brubaker-Clark with the Greater Muskegon Economic Development, or GMED. And along with our partners, the Lakeshore Chamber of Commerce and the Community Foundation for Muskegon County, we're providing this training webinar virtually. And even without COVID, we thought this will be a good idea for the future because it allows more people to attend the training than having to drive to Lansing or some other place. So we do anticipate holding these training sessions at least once a year in the future as new board members come on, new commissioners come on to your various boards and commissions and committees, so that we can keep up a constant stream of training within Muskegon County. Also, I want to let you know that this webinar is this Zoom meeting presentation is being recorded so that you can go back later. We will have that posted on our GMED website. And please encourage any others from your planning commissions and ZBAs who were not able to attend. They can go on and watch the webinar in the future. I want to introduce our trainers today, Kathleen Duffy and Carmen Avantini. Kathleen is a planning consultant at the Smith Group and has a wide variety of planning experience ranging from small cities to large cities, rural townships, urban centers. She specializes in land use, neighborhood planning, urban design, and comprehensive plans. Carmen is president of CIB Planning, a community planning consulting firm located in Fenton, Michigan. He has over 38 years of planning experience and specializes in downtown development, economic development, zoning, and site redevelopment. I'd also like to introduce Emily Morgenstern from the Chamber of Commerce and Contessa Hood from GMED. If you can give a little wave, Emily and Contessa, thank you. They are hosting our presentation today, and they will be addressing questions later in our session to Kathleen and Carmen. And I'll let Kathleen, when she starts, she'll tell you how best to address those questions as we go through this. So with that, I would like to turn over our presentation to Kathleen and Carmen.
Thanks, Kathy. Good morning, everyone, bright and early on this sunshiny spring day. Thanks for joining us. We're gonna be all together for the first hour here. Carmen and I will share the training for what we think is applicable to both planning commissions and ZBAs. But then about halfway through, we'd like to break out into 2 breakout rooms where you'll get to pick if one topic is a bit more applicable to you depending on what kind of commission you're on. We'll go into a bit more detail I'll teach on the Planning Commission and Carmen will teach on the Zoning Board of Appeals, and then we'll all come back together at the end for Q&A. I think we can try and potentially do some discussion talking during our breakout sessions, and if there are questions, you can type them in the chat, but we'd encourage you to hold them a little bit just to see if we might answer it later in the training. But definitely do put things into the chat as we go along, and we'll have our facilitators grab those for us, and we'll try and have some opportunities to participate at a couple key points throughout the morning. So with that, we'd love to hear your introductions as well. Kathy just introduced Carmen and me, but if you can put in the chat your name and your municipality. I see some of you have them on your name, which is awesome, in your in your Zoom profile. But if you can, in the chat, type in your name, your municipality, if you're on a board or commission, or if you're staff, and then how many years you've been in that role. That helps us just kind of understand who we're working with. And if we were in person, we would obviously be able to have a much more robust conversation around that, but that'll just help Carmen and me tailor some of our comments, knowing what who you're representing and for how long. So just take a second. Welcome, Diane. Everyone else. Awesome. Ken and Ton. On Shores. So we've got lots of couple seasoned folks, it looks like, and other people really freshly new to their position. So this will be great, great training. So those of you that are, supervisors and zoning administrators will just have to pick which session you want to go to in the breakout session, but we'll make the recording available and the slides available so that even if you have to pick one, you can hear what the other one is, because it's probably applicable to both of you. Those. So awesome. Thanks, everyone, for letting us know where you're from. All right, so let's move along. So I think just a quick introduction on why we're talking about planning and zoning and the delicate balancing act that always comes along with making planning and zoning decisions. I think there are two balancing interests when it comes to planning and zoning. Allowing people to do things to their property with as property owners, but then there's the making sure that we're protecting the public health, safety, and welfare as well. And so when it comes down to planning, that's kind of where our rights are vested, in balancing those two issues legally, and that's how we're empowered to plan. It can be a tricky balancing act, wanting to allow someone to do something to their property, but we want to make sure that everyone's treated fairly and the collective whole is all making the public interest just as weighted heavily in that as well, to make sure that communities are planned and thoughtfully planned and built and developed over time, that protects people's rights as well as a whole. Just a little introduction here to thinking about how planning and zoning are work together. It's kind of hard to separate them. But they're a set of tools that think about like the long range and trying to achieve a greater vision down the future. And then a set of tools that help you to get things built right now and what's legally enforced on your property today. And so why we have all of these tools is to make sure that there's a plan and that things aren't just happening haphazardly, that things make sense, that we grow or reinvest and redevelop in a way that's very not controlled, but planned in a way that it is useful for meeting that longer term vision, protecting those private property values, but also looking out for the greater common good. So an efficient use of services, looking at preserving natural resources and preserving agricultural our wonderful history of agriculture in Michigan as well, and making sure that things are growing fairly and in harmony with one another, so that we aren't having a residential development go in before the utilities are ready to be out there, reinforcing the historic character of the communities that we live in, and celebrating our downtowns and our town centers, and embracing everything that makes our communities so wonderful in Michigan. And so making sure that if we provide a strong base, both in planning and zoning, that then helps support decision making at other levels of government. So the role of the Planning Commission and the ZBA working together with the legislative officials, whether it's a township board or a city commission or council, that it's a collaborative effort that's based on a shared set of facts and a shared common vision that gets embedded into the regulations for the community and has that day-to-day decision making based on something. So in Michigan, there are a few different acts that we have from the legislature that enable us as local municipalities to plan and zone. So I'll explain briefly the Planning Enabling Act and Zoning Enabling Act, but there's also the Land Division Act, and then there's federal and state and local case law. So when someone has a suit against a municipality, usually somewhere else in the country, it can have effects on how we legislate locally. So a recent example, maybe like 5 years ago, there was a sign ordinance that was challenged in another state that made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and that then affects how we can regulate signs here in Michigan. So we as planners and zoning professionals have to keep abreast of all of the legislative and legal cases as well. And so usually having an attorney involved is definitely strongly recommended in redoing any of your ordinances and interpreting things to make sure that your municipality is covering its bases. The primary two things that we're going to cover today are the Planning Enabling Act and the Zoning Enabling Act. And so as their names describe, one covers more of the Planning Commission side of things, the master plan, and the powers vested in those authorities, and then the Zoning Enabling Act, which is, as its name describes, more about how the zoning ordinance works. So a lot of the content in here is from Carmen and my experience and what we think are best practices, but a good chunk of it is rooted in what the law allows us to do. So a quick overview of the different roles of each of these bodies. And if you go back to, Schoolhouse Rock days, where you have 3 branches of government at the federal and state levels, it works at the municipal level as well. So we've got an administrative, legislative, and a kind of quasi-judicial branch of government. So if you think of city council or township board or that legislative body as being elected representative officials that are elected by the people, they're like the legislature, right? They're representative and on behalf of the people elected to pass laws and review and adopt ordinances and budgets and all of that stuff that happens at that council level. But the Planning Commission is more of an administrative side of things. So there's often planning staff. Several of you have wear zoning administrator hats. Sometimes the township supervisor has some roles related more in the administrative side of things, or the city manager. The Planning Commission is there to do a lot of the hard work that then gets acted upon by the council. And so we'll get into a lot more detail on this, but making sure that that master plan, which is the long-term vision for the community, is up to date and reflects the vision of the community. Looking at the zoning ordinance, often council or the board will say, hey, Planning Commission, we're getting a lot of variance requests on fences. It's time for us to look at the fence ordinance and go in and make sure it still makes sense. We'd rather you update the ordinance than grant all these variances. So it's time for us to do that. And thinking of the zoning ordinance and master plan as living documents, yes, they're adopted at certain points in time, but they can always be amended. And so having the Planning Commission be kind of the working group that works through some of those. The day-to-day tasks of the Planning Commission are looking at development reviews. And so when a new project comes in for site plan review, staff might do a review of it, but sometimes it has to go to Planning Commission for them to evaluate whether it meets the zoning ordinance or not. And finally, the capital improvements plan is another task that is designated in the Planning Enabling Act to the Planning Commission, which sometimes gets worked on collaboratively with other bodies at the municipality. And then finally, that ZBA or BZA, depending on what community you're in, Board of Zoning Appeals or Zoning Board of Appeals, is really, think of it as a quasi-judicial group. So they're more like judges. So they're not there to legislate, they're not there to write the ordinance or amend the ordinance. They're there to rule on whether the ordinance was applied correctly. So There are a set of different tasks that go into what the ZBA is charged with in terms of interpreting. Sometimes the zoning ordinance gets challenged because it's vague. Hopefully you've written an ordinance that's more robust enough that it's not a vague, there's not any vagaries in there, but the idea is that they would then be they're removed from the decision making and are weighing in on whether the on how to interpret the zoning ordinance, and also appeals if someone at the administrative level or planning commission level has ruled that on a zoning decision people can appeal to, just like you would appeal in the court system, to the ZBA on certain zoning decisions. That's pretty rare. Primarily we see our ZBAs are handling variances and things like that. So we'll get into a little bit of that together, and Carmen will go into even more detail when we break out into the ZBA specific training. So when it comes to the Planning Commission, there are a few other things that we just want to hit on, and I'll go into more detail in the Planning Commission breakout on this. So per the MPA, those planning commissions need to meet 4 times a year. They can also be called upon to review public projects that are going on in terms of bigger, municipally funded public infrastructure improvements and things like that, which relates to the capital improvement plan. And they're also charged with creating an annual report that then goes back to council or township board, where they are providing an update of what has happened in the last year and what they'd like to work on in the future. So as an appointed body, making sure that they're reporting back and forth with council. So ZBA, again, they're dealing with variances, the appeal side of things, called upon to interpret if the zoning, there's a discrepancy or uncertainty in the ordinance or in the zoning map, called upon to interpret that, and other duties that they can be called upon to look at in the zoning ordinance, depending on your community. So just quickly on variances, we wanted to make sure that we touched on this with both groups, because Carmen will get into more detail with the ZBA specifically, but for those of you not going to that, I wanted to touch on it a bit here to make sure that you understand that variances are not a means to get around the ordinance. And I think often they're used as that. They're used, an applicant may say, well, I just don't think that the ordinance applies to me in this case, and I want to have a taller fence, or I, want to build a larger garage or a taller building just because that is what is, important to me. And the strict rule of the law and how we encourage ZBAs to function, and variances should only be granted in the rarest of occasions. They're meant to be acknowledge that the ordinance cannot anticipate every rare case. And so when you're thinking about a set of standards for a district, let's say, you have some generalizations that every parcel is a certain size and shape, but those non-use variances or dimensional variances should only be granted in the rarest of occasions where the parcel itself is different. So it doesn't have anything to do with the property owner, the applicant, the proposal at hand. It has to do with the broader context of the ordinance and how that lot is different than others. So don't if you're getting a lot of variance requests and they don't meet the strict letter of those criteria to grant the variance, it's probably time to just update that ordinance. We'd much rather you have the ordinance be tweaked to allow taller fences or to allow larger garages, not to just continually granting exceptions to the rule, because each of those times someone is granted that, you're treating them differently than you are their neighbors. And so there's really strict case law on how much you can deviate from things, and making sure that the specific law at hand has a difference that makes it eligible for that variance. So if that's something that's interesting to you, go to the ZBA breakout and Carmen will talk a bit more on that one. So fundamentally, everything is based on the master plan when it comes to planning and zoning. So there are a number of key pieces. All these different bodies have a role in the development process. And we want to just make sure that everyone understands that the master plan is the long-term vision for the community. And in order to have a zoning ordinance, you have to have a master plan that guides those decisions. So having that as a comprehensive plan, sometimes it's called, that dictates that overall vision for the community and reasons for why things should be rezoned or why you're developing in a certain way. It needs to be in that policy document. Have your zoning up to date. Like I said, the zoning ordinance doesn't have to be a static document. I know communities that regularly are doing updates annually because they realize that things are need to be tweaked. So we as consultants and your attorneys and your staff can only guess how applications are going to come in and writing those standards to meet what we anticipate. But there's always going to be something that comes in that we can't anticipate. And so again, amend your ordinance. Don't just say, oh, go get a variance, because it can be challenging, but you want to make sure that everything's fair for everyone that's applying. There are a bunch of other pieces that come into the redevelopment and development game, and that's related to financial mechanisms for getting things funded. And so your communities may have a DDA, a Downtown Development Authority, a CIA, a Corridor Improvement Authority. Those are groups that use what's called TIF financing, tax increment financing, which is another section of the state acts that permits ways of capturing future tax increases to help invest in those districts. That's a whole other training. Like Carmen actually will be teaching a training on that at lunchtime today. We want to make sure that you're understanding what the relationship is between those developers and the community as well. Often we have developer roundtables and vetting ideas and concepts and understanding where they're coming from or what they're having a friendly conversation, not adversarial if you can help it, to try and understand what their struggles are, but where they're having gaps and where the municipality might be able to help them achieve those gaps, where state agencies might come in to help, whether it's through brownfield authorities or the Redevelopment Ready Communities program. All of these different agencies at the state and local level work together to really want to make sure that development is easy. It should never be a headache for anyone trying to apply to the process. So having a very sympathetic to the developers while still protecting the public interest. So in some places they veer too heavy in one of those directions, and it's really like I said at the beginning, a balancing act to make sure that we're addressing the needs of the developers while not being beholden to them. I think strongly encourage the development at all costs. We just need that tax dollars. I would be reluctant to promote that, because you want to make sure that you're thinking about how those decisions they're relatively permanent. When someone builds a new building or develops a new piece of land, it's going to be a while before it gets redeveloped or could change in the future. So decisions that we make now really affect us down the line. And so making sure that each of these different bubbles in this diagram isn't more important than the other. They all need to work together and understand what each other is up to. And so by having that master plan that's a cohesive vision across all of the different players in the game, having focus groups and discussions and roundtables with different people that are part of that process is really important to make sure that we understand where there are hiccups in the process, where things could be smoothed out a bit, where it's important to engage with the neighbors, where it's important to have a pre-development review process with the staff to go over the ordinance before they even apply, making sure that whole application review process is streamlined, easy to understand, but reflects the vision and the goals and policies of the community. So just briefly, I'll go into a lot more on the master plan in the Planning Commission session. So feel free to join that breakout session if that's important. But just real quickly, we wanted to go over the differences between a master plan and zoning because our ZBA friends need to hear this as well. So when it comes to having a zoning ordinance, the state legislation says that if you have a zoning ordinance, it must be based on a master plan. And the reason for that is so that it guides the future zoning changes. So when you come to amend your zoning ordinance or rezone a property, it has one of those criteria says, what does the master plan say should happen here? And so the master plan is a longer term vision for 20 years out in the future. And how do we make sure that we're envisioning that? And then that provides the basis to say, okay, well, zoning is our day-to-day tool for implementing the master plan. Let's incrementally make sure we're working towards that longer range policy vision that's in the master plan. So there are checks in there that you want to make sure if that, like I mentioned earlier, you don't want to be building a subdivision out when you're not ready to fund infrastructure improvements out in too far away from the city center, or other future land use things related to redevelopment and saying, well, we really want to like encourage this corridor to redevelop with more residential. You want to set that up in the master plan so that when it comes time to amend that corridor district in the zoning ordinance, it's based on the community's vision in the master plan. So that master plan is a policy document. It's primarily the Planning Commission's responsibility to prepare, usually with staff and consultants helping. And council does have, or your township board does have the ability to exert your authority to adopt it as well. And we usually encourage communities to have both Planning Commission and council adopt it to show that everyone's on the same page. But in terms of zoning, that is absolutely your legislative body, your council or township boards authority to adopt that. So Planning Commission will often create the zoning ordinance amendments with staff or consultants and recommend it to council, who then adopts it because it's a code in your code of ordinances at the legislative level with your legislative body. So think of the master plan of kind of that overarching vision, and then the zoning ordinance is the law today for what you can do with your property today. So with that, we're going to transition into a little bit more detail on zoning and plan review. So as I said, zoning needs to be based on a plan. And so as the legally enforceable tool that dictates how you can use your property today, those zoning requirements run with the land. So it doesn't have, it's not applied to the owner. It's related to what that parcel is and how it's used. And they're permanent. So when you rule on an approval or a variance, those decisions they run with the property itself and go beyond who the next owner is and are not changeable unless there's a new application down the line. Just a second, allergies this morning. So the ordinance may have mechanisms in it that say things like if you don't act upon your approval, if you apply for a site plan process and the Planning Commission approves the site plan, if you don't start building within a certain time frame, then you can lose your approval authority after a certain period of time, 6 months or a year or whatever is in there. But it's the law, and those decisions are permanent for regulating what happens with the parcel itself. Again, it's not dependent on the owner or user. So a quick overview of what's contained in a zoning ordinance. Each community's zoning ordinance is different, but they all generally have the same set of component parts that are outlined in both the Zoning Enabling Act requires certain things, and then just best practices over time have made it so that we organize them generally in similar ways, but each community is different, and depending on where one is applying, they really have to look at that local municipally adopted zoning ordinance because it's going to be different. So Muskegon Heights is different from the city of Muskegon, which is different from Layton Township, and all of your different municipalities each have their own zoning ordinance. And each community defines terms in a different way. So we're going to give some general definitions of some of these terms, but you need to make sure that you look at your ordinance's definitions for how they have described it. Everyone describes front yards slightly differently. It depends on what community you're in. You can't just assume what the front yard is. Generally, uses and dimensional requirements vary by districts. So you've got different zoning districts for different types of sets of uses and mixed uses, and those different character is embedded via different lot sizes and setbacks and things and building height related to districts. And by those districts, we look at how they all operate together, right? We don't want to have one parcel next to another parcel and they're all zoned something different. The idea is that you're treating people fairly across the district. There's usually a big chunk of articles in there on site design related things. So there's probably a landscaping section, a section on lighting, a section on access management, which is related to driveways and making sure you don't have too many driveway cuts. That may be in the parking section. So you have to reference what's in the district section, but then there are other sections that apply across all the districts. General provisions, things that apply across all those districts. So we don't write them all in each separate district, but we refer you to another section to make sure that you are checking out those regulations as well. Then there's the administrative provisions in the ordinance. So the process, so what are requirements of the site plan review process and standards for review. So Carmen will get into a bit more of this a little bit later. We want to make sure that all of those are outlined clearly so that, again, everyone's treated fairly when they're applying. And then again, it's the zoning ordinance sets up the ZBA, their role and standards for those different types of variances. So just quickly before I turn it over to Carmen, some quick nomenclature of things that are often defined, like I said, in your zoning ordinance. So lot lines, understanding what we mean by a lot versus a parcel can have different terminology. The yard, the front yard versus the side yard versus the rear yard. Setbacks are those how far from the lot line you're allowed to build. So we don't want buildings right on top of each other in some districts. In other districts, we want them to be like a downtown where we want them to have zero side lot lines, side setbacks. So there's no setback on the side yard or maybe the front yard in a downtown where they're built right up to the front sidewalk and next to their neighbors. So just depending on the character of the district, those setbacks vary. Building height, there are definitions for when you're on a corner lot, might have different setbacks off of that side yard, off of the side street. There are things in there that are defined for permitted uses versus special land use, which Carmen will get into a bit more detail. All of these different terms and how they're used are defined within the ordinance itself. So we generally, as practitioners, have a rule of thumb for what each of these different definitions mean. But you want to make sure that you look in your ordinance so that it describes how each of them are used, how a principal use versus an accessory use. So your single family home versus your garage. And nonconformities, Carmen will explain a little bit too, is more about those things that don't exactly meet the ordinance, but we're allowing them to exist because they kind of get grandfathered in. So all of these things, check your ordinance. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carmen to get into more of the details on zoning.
Thank you, Kathleen. Are you going to change the slides for me? Or
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, as Kathleen indicated, there's and good morning to everybody. I too am dealing with the allergies, so if I happen to sneeze or whatever, please ignore it. So site plan review it can be handled in a couple of different ways. One is administrative. The ordinance will say if it's under a certain size, or you're just changing the use, or this building's only 3,000 square feet and you can do up to 5,000 square feet, you can approve these site plans administratively. And the reason is it makes it go through the process a lot quicker and takes some of the burden off of the planning commission. But there will be other things in your ordinance that say they have to go to the planning commission. Maybe they're bigger projects. It's a mixed use project, could be a plan unit development, Or if you have a special land use involved, you typically have to have your site plan lined up with the special land use and you deal with them at the same time. So there's a number of different ways that we can look at a site plan. We prefer to do as many as possible administratively, just because it makes the process move a little bit smoother. Next slide. So with a site plan review, what we're trying to do is make sure that sites are laid out in such a fashion that they're safe, they're efficient, they look good, they work properly. Because I think we've all seen different sites that are developed, projects that are developed, and you're wondering, wow, who designed this? It doesn't work really well. So we want to keep that sort of thing from happening. There's a couple of ways that we do that. One is in our site plan review section of the ordinance, we put general standards in there, because you can't possibly write everything into your ordinance specifically. And for those of you on the Planning Commission, I'm sure you've heard an applicant say, well, you didn't say that specifically in the ordinance, so you don't have the right to tell me what to do. And it's like, well, yeah, we do, because if you look at our general standards in the site plan review section, we're also responsible for making sure that, for example, there's safe, efficient traffic circulation through the site, that there's proper landscaping, you know, those sorts of things. You can find general standards. So you do have discretion. Now, it's also good to have specific standards. You want to have standards like parking, how many spaces are required, depending on the size and type of use, size of the building and type of use. You know, what landscaping requirements are there? How big can your signs be? What kind of materials do you have to use on your building? So those are things that you can find in your ordinance that are very specific. And these two different sets of standards complement each other and give you the ability to help develop good sites. Okay, next. Now, when you're first looking at, when somebody's proposing something, the first thing you really look at is the use. What kind of use is it? And you'll look at a district and it'll say, these are permitted uses and these are special land uses. So permitted uses are those that are automatically allowed in that zoning district. So if you go to a residential district and it says single family houses, those are permitted uses. It might say you're allowed to have adult daycare facility up to a certain size. That would be a special land use. And a special land use is something where you have to have a public hearing, and it typically has to be reviewed at least by the Planning Commission. Some communities also have it go to the elected body, but we encourage them to be, those decisions to be made at the Planning Commission level. The one challenge with special land uses is it slows the process down. And I'll admit that we as planners for many years tried to make everything a special land use because it would give us better control over things. But we found out, you know, over the years that, you know, 95% of the special land uses, you have a public hearing and nobody shows up. Okay, so we're getting to the point now in our careers where we're trying to reduce the number of special land uses and make more uses permitted. Now, keep in mind, if you're looking at a use in a particular zoning district and you're trying to see if it fits, if you don't see it there, but you see that use in another zoning district, then it's not allowed in the district where you were looking at first. Okay, that's an important thing to keep in mind. The other thing is the use has to be approved if all standards are met. So if this is a permitted use, and they meet all the site plan review standards of the ordinance, doesn't matter if you like it or not, you have to approve it. Doesn't always happen, but you're supposed to do that. Next slide, please. Now, one thing you can do, however, and you'll see this with special land uses, and there may be special conditions in there, or even with your site plan, is you can approve with conditions. Okay, the purpose of a special land use, keep in mind, is to ensure that uses don't become what I call bigger and badder, because they can grow and they can get out of scale with the area that they're in. And you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. One of the ways you do that is with conditions. So you can attach conditions to a site plan or to a special land use. They have to be related, though, to what you're trying to mitigate. So if you're saying, well, we're worried about the headlights from that car shining over into the next door neighbor's property. Okay, then one of your conditions can be that we're going to put a landscape hedge along the property line to help screen those headlights. A condition that wouldn't be acceptable is, oh, we want you to make these improvements on the other side of your building, and they have nothing to do with the problem you're trying to mitigate. Okay, there has to be a relationship between the issue and the condition. And one thing to also keep in mind too is these conditions apply to the site, not to the owner. Okay, if somebody sells a property, those conditions go with the property and the use can go with the property. Okay, next. So what we want to do is we want to approve these projects, or if they're not approvable, deny them. But moreover, we want to create a streamlined, inviting process. I can tell you that in the communities we work in, for the most part, it takes you 30 days to get through the review process. Okay, that includes giving the applicant an opportunity to revise plans and turn them back in. Now, we want to do that because we have two goals in mind. One, we want to be developer friendly. And number two, we want to have high standards. We want to make sure that the developments that are approved are of a high quality. So if you come in with a plan that meets all of our requirements and it's a great project, we're going to get you through that project quickly. If it's not a good project, if it's not something that meets our ordinance requirements and our standards, then it's not going to get through that quickly. So it's kind of the carrot and the stick. So we want to create an inviting development climate. We want to ensure that you've got a smooth and predictable experience. But once again, we also want to make sure that it complies with those standards of the ordinance. Now, one of the ways that you accomplish that is making sure that you have internal procedures. It's very important. Everything from the person who's taking the application to where does it go next, to who's doing the legal notice if one's required, to how many days before all of the reviewers have to submit their first set of reviews, to when does the applicant have to have those revised plans turned in again, to when is the planning commission meeting. All of those things have to be in place and very organized and followed. And then you also want to make sure that those procedures and the timelines are communicated to the applicant and applicants. So when they call up and say, where am I in the process, you can tell them. They'll know, you'll know exactly where they are. Next slide. Now, one of the plan unit developments, this is I don't know how many of you have dealt with these before, but this is kind of it's a flexible zoning tool that communities can use that gives you the ability to come up with a better quality project, and also as a community keep a little bit better control over it to make sure that it stays that way. So what it does is a plan unit development, which is a zoning, typically you have to have a site rezoned to plan unit development. And what it does is it allows flexibility in the dimensional requirements. So if you can't meet setbacks, or you don't have the right lot size, or you can't meet certain aspects of the zoning ordinance, but you have a better way of doing it, then the planning commission can waive those requirements. You don't have to go to the zoning board of appeals and prove practical difficulty. Now, when I teach the breakout session in a little while for zoning board of appeals, I'll talk a little bit more about practical difficulty. But it eliminates one set of review and a public hearing in order to get you through the process more quickly and also come up with a better project. Typically, we use plan unit developments for larger scale and mixed use developments, but we found that it's also a good infill redevelopment tool. You can do it on single sites also if you have your ordinance set up that way. Now, one of the things you want to make sure is that they, however, are providing a demonstrated benefit that cannot be achieved if you're using regular zoning. We don't want to use plan unit developments, as Kathleen indicated, to circumvent the ordinance. We want to use it as a win-win type of tool. Next slide. So when do we want to amend our zoning text and map? Okay, this is something that's really critical because things change a lot, and things are really changing a lot right now with land uses. And we want to always make sure we're on top of things. So if we're going to amend our ordinance, we want to make sure that we're constantly updating or regularly, I should say, not constantly, but regularly updating our master plan to reflect the development trends and the things that are happening. And I think we're all going to be looking at that a little more closely as we come out of the pandemic and more people have gotten used to working at home, for example. So we're going to want to talk about that in our master plan. And then we're going to want to update our text and potentially our map even, but most likely our text. and we want to clarify our language in the text to make sure that it's doing exactly what we're saying in the master plan. We're also going to add new language, I'm sure, as we come out of this. We're probably going to see a new set of definitions dealing with home occupations and home offices in particular, because home office can be something as simple as us doing this presentation right now. We're all sitting behind our computers and we're not meeting with anybody. Nobody comes to visit us, and that's fine. But you're going to have other folks who all of a sudden, they've gotten really busy at home, and they're going to start having people coming to visit them. And we have to be careful that it's not getting out of control. So we might want to change our procedures and requirements when we amend the ordinance. The other thing we also want to look at too when we change the ordinance are we going to add any special districts, or are we going to do overlays like a plan unit development? Next slide. So Kathleen also mentioned nonconformities. So what happens is at some point in time, we adopted zoning ordinances. We didn't always have zoning ordinances. At some point in time, we adopted ordinances, and we have ordinances that change. So what do you do about all of the existing sites, uses, and buildings, especially sites we see that no longer comply with ordinance requirements? Okay, we call this being grandfathered to. That's probably the term you hear more often. So how are we going to handle these non-conforming situations? There's a lot of different ways to deal with it. One is to eliminate them. And there are ordinances that say over time, we want to eliminate nonconformities and you can't change them or expand them. That's one perspective. Another one that I like to use in ordinances that I'm involved in writing is to bring that use or that site and that building in particular into greater conformity. So for example, if you've got a big pole sign and you don't allow pole signs anymore, maybe you negotiate an agreement with a business to say, look, we'll let you put an electronic message board on your sign, but you have to put a smaller conforming pylon sign, monument sign as an exchange. So that there's a lot of different ways of decreasing the non-conforming situation. One thing to keep in mind too is that non-conforming situations can continue unless they're abandoned. Most ordinance will have written into there, especially for like structures, that it can continue unless it's 50% destroyed in one way or another, fire or whatever it might be. It's hit by a car if it's a sign. But non-conforming situations are never impacted by change in ownership. That's something to keep in mind with land uses and with zoning. It's not based on who owns the property. It's not based on whether it's owner occupied or renter occupied. It's only based on the characteristics of that property in particular and any conditions you've attached to them. So if a property has a special land use and site plan approval and somebody comes in and buys that property, that business, as long as they continue to meet the site plan review requirements and the special land use requirements, they're allowed to continue as is without any kind of approval, other than building code type things. Obviously, that's a little bit different. You may have a business registration or something like that. But for zoning purposes, it has no impact. It can just continue on. Okay, the next one. Now, when we're making these decisions at the board level, some things we want to make sure we're doing is we want to make sure that we're being fair. We want to be consistent in terms of the decisions that we're making. We want to make sure we're dealing equally with applicants from one to the next. We want to make sure that we're clear in the decisions that we're making. And we also want to make sure that they're defendable. Because some people will say, well, you're not treating me properly, you're not doing the right thing, and you need to be able to defend those decisions. Sometimes you end up in a court of law over those. Next one. So here are the expectations. It's usually, my experience has been that, maybe, I hate to give a percentage, but maybe 95% of all the projects that you end up reviewing, if you do these things, you're going to end up with a positive result. You're always going to have, developers that are a challenge. And you're also going to have those issues that a planning commission or zoning board of appeals is reviewing. And for whatever reason, they don't like it. So it's not always the developer that's the bad guy. Sometimes it can be a board, or it can be the community that's the bad guy. But we try to avoid that as much as possible. So the expectations are that from the municipality end, we want to have quality development. We want to minimize the impacts on the surrounding properties. We want to be consistent with the community's vision and goals. And we want to create tax space. I mean, we have to be able to pay for the services we're offering. Now, from the developer's end, they want to be able to get reasonable use of the property. You know, is our financial return reasonable? It doesn't have to be the optimum, but is it reasonable? Are we being treated fairly? And is it a predictable process? One thing I can tell you developers do not like is when they see another developer or property owner being treated differently than them. And it's a very similar situation. Nothing will get them angrier than that. They may not even like the rules that you've created, but if they know that you're applying that rule evenly to everybody, they take it a lot better. Developers are looking for some flexibility. How are you going to work with us to make this project better and make it happen? Time is money with folks that are developing. Okay. If it takes them a lot longer to get an approval, it's costing them money. They would much rather work with you up front to give you what you're looking for than have to spend money on options for a property that they have under contract. Public hearings, developers don't like public hearings for the most part. Actually, we planners in many cases don't like public hearings either. The goal of a public hearing is to get new information and factual information, not to hear how many people like or dislike a particular project. And from the other developer end, it's prompt inspections. We've had situations in communities where it's like, we have a great review process. We get people through quickly. When they hit building, it takes them forever to get their building permits. Inspections and the approval process there takes forever. So you want to make sure that that is also something that's handled expeditiously. Next. So once again, be consistent. Treat all applicants and developments equally. Applicants and citizens are more likely to cooperate when dealt with fairly. And this is also a case where you might have somebody who's angry, but if they know they're being treated fairly, they may be less angry. They might not like the issue, but at least they know you're treating them fairly and equitably. Next. So the process we're going to follow, this is kind of a general process. So what is the proposed use that people are asking for? Is it a permitted use or is it a special land use? Did they prepare a site plan? Okay, I had somebody for a current planning commission meeting coming up and they wanted site plan approval and they submitted their application and they submitted a building floor plan and there's no site plan. And I've got the community asking me for a review letter on the site plan. Like, I can't give you one. You didn't give me a site plan. So they're not going to be on the agenda. They need to give a site plan. We prepare staff reports. You might have staff in your community that does that. So you have staff report, and many times you have consultants or department heads that are also preparing reports. And often we as planners pull them all together and organize them, or the staff will do that, make some sense out of them. Where required, there's a public hearing and there is a public notice that has to be in the paper 14 days ahead of the public hearing. Then we go to the Planning Commission or the Zoning Board of Appeals and we get a decision is made. We want to document that decision through the minutes. And then ultimately there's enforcement to make sure that they're doing what they were approved for. Always make sure after a site plan is approved that number one, they give you a site plan. It has all the conditions addressed. And number two, that there aren't changes between the site plan and the construction drawings, because that happens all the time. I had a case where there's a hotel being proposed and we had to go through 3 different versions of their building elevations until they met the ordinance requirements. They got their site plan approval and then they submitted their construction drawings and it had the first building elevation set that they submitted where we said, absolutely not. So you just got to be careful. And if the building people don't know that, it could be a problem. So we want to make sure we do that. Okay, next. So in terms of making your decision, follow proper notification procedures. Accept only complete applications. This is very important. Don't take bits and pieces. Make sure it's a complete application, especially the revised ones. Make sure you have all your staff reports together and keep them in the file. Do your homework if you're on the Planning Commission or Zoning Board of Appeals. Review the packets, visit the site if possible. If you can't, you can always use Google Maps and Street View to be able to go out there and look at it. And avoid ex parte contacts. In other words, if you're out looking at a site, and the property owner comes out and tries talking to you about the project, do your best to not talk to them about it and say, look, I really can't talk about this. I'm just here to look at the site. Another thing you'll want to do too is when you go to the meeting, before any business is taken care of, ask the chair to give you an opportunity to speak up and say, look, when I was out visiting this site, the owner of the property came out and here's what we said, and tell them exactly what you said. Because I've had situations where an applicant will get up and say, well, I went out and when I saw the planning commissioner out on the site, and the planning commissioner said that he or she didn't think that this would be a problem and I should get approved. And you may not have said that at all. Okay. And it puts you in the hot seat. So make sure you, before that the applicant has a chance to even talk, that you let the planning commission or ZBA know exactly what was said during that encounter. Okay, next. So deliberation. Okay, make sure that there's always some level of formality. Okay, make sure that all the comments go through the chair. Madam Chair or Mr. Chair, every time you speak, do that. Limit the speaking time for people in the number of times they can speak, and encourage them to have a spokesperson so you're not hearing the same thing over and over again. Once again, for the decision makers, all comments have to go through the chair. Make sure you deliberate in the open. Express your opinions. I had a planning commission meeting once where a person on the planning commission didn't say a single word and then voted against something. That's not fair for the applicant. And then finally, use the ordinance standards for your decisions. And once the public hearing is closed, if you got a public hearing, keep it closed, because once you open it back up or you let people speak and so forth, you're going to lose control of that public hearing. Once you lose control, it's hard to get it back. And I love the banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything in NIMBY, not in my backyard. I think we're all pretty familiar with those situations where you get citizens that don't want anything to happen. They don't like change, and we see it all the time. Next, and I know we're getting close here. So in terms of making decisions, you always want to make sure that somebody makes a motion and somebody seconds it. You want to indicate what the request is, and then you have to take action. And in there, you might have to have conditions. Okay, so I make a motion that we approve this conditioned upon these things. I know we as planners like to include in review letters in our recommendation what conditions can be. It makes it easier for the planning commission members in particular, because then they can say with conditions 1, 2, 3, and 5, because you've already talked about 4 and that's no longer necessary. Okay. Without those conditions, though, you might not be wanting to approve that particular request. Okay, let's go to the next one. Make sure you follow the ordinance standards when you're making a decision, and also include those in your conditions if you need to. Remember that a public hearing is only to get information, not to take a straw poll, because if the standards are met, you have to approve it. Next. Documentation. I think all the motions have to include this information here, and you should get a copy of the handout here if you need to refer to that. Just make sure that your motions are clear, that everything is presented, and people know exactly what they're voting on. If you don't know what you're voting on, chances are somebody else doesn't know what they're voting on either. Always make sure, don't worry about, coming across as being, you don't know what you're doing. Always ask if you don't know what the motion is about. Next. Conflict of interest. So what is, and we run into this quite a bit, what is a conflict of interest? Relationship with the applicant, maybe your spouse or a child. If it's a distant cousin, that's not really conflict of interest. The big one is there a potential financial gain or loss to you directly? Are you the banker that's lending the money for the project and you're the loan officer? Okay, that could be a conflict of interest. Are you a partner in that company? That could be a conflict of interest. If you're not sure, first of all, you can discuss your possible conflicts with the attorney. But if you're not sure, what you should do, and this isn't state law, let the chair know that you may have a conflict of interest. So the chair will say, okay, what is your potential conflict of interest? State your conflict of interest, and then it's up to the rest of the members, not you, but the rest of the members, to vote on whether they think you have a conflict of interest. Some people say they have a conflict of interest and they don't, because they don't want to have to make the difficult decision. Okay, that's not a good reason to not do it. So it's up to the rest of the board members to make that decision. If you do have a conflict of interest, you have to leave the facility completely. You can't even be where you can hear the discussion, and you can't be seen. You have to leave the room, you have to leave the building, whatever it takes, you can't be there. And all of this should be detailed in your either bylaws or ethics policy. Okay, next. Now, the only reason you can get rid of people basically is if they do something wrong, and there's malfeasance and misfeasance. And the one thing I've seen was where I had a zoning board of appeals that was granting variances for something because they did not agree with the elected officials and what they put into the zoning ordinance. And they said, we don't care whether it's in the ordinance, we're going to vote against it, or we're going to approve these anyway. They should have all been removed. They weren't, but they should have all been removed because that clearly is not what you do. Next. Okay, I think I'm timed.
Yeah, we're making good time.
We're close.
So if we can get some help from our friends to open up the breakout rooms. So again, I'm going to be leading the next half an hour on more detail on planning commissions, and Carmen is going to be leading it on ZBA. So we just, to keep the sessions short, we wanted to do some overlapping training. So I hope that you can pick one of those breakout rooms. And if we can get our Emily or Contessa to explain how we open up those breakout rooms. Do we click on join breakout room? Yes. So
yep, you guys can choose which breakout room to go to.
And the instructors too, right?